Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Gabriel Soto, and I am a senior director at Edison Research.
Hi, and I'm Ollie Chadwick. I'm the UK Regional Director at AdsWiz.
So it's great to be in London, Ali.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Everyone is so happy here. Everyone is so welcoming, except when I don't know what to do when I cross the streets because in America, the streets are reversed. It gets a little complicated for me. I feel paralyzed sometimes.
Just run.
Yeah. Um, So it's great to be back here. Ali and I have teamed up today to bring you the Infinite Dial UK. In case you're unfamiliar with this study, by the end of this presentation, you'll understand the state of technology and media consumption in the UK on the consumer side. Ali, thank you so much for being here, and thank you, AdsWiz and SiriusXM. We were able to bring back this study because you all sponsored this study here in the UK again. Why was it so important for you to bring this back to this market?
Yeah, I think it's super important. We obviously did it some years ago now, and the market, the industry, technology has moved on so significantly. I think it's important to highlight that, but also for us, we want to support this research in order to promote the podcasting industry specifically, digital audio more generally, because AdsWiz works in the entire space, and help bring more advertisers to the medium.
And speaking of advertising, so when I think of AdsWiz, I think of this endless wisdom on the podcast advertising space. A space that can get pretty confusing, especially for me. What can you tell us about AdsWiz? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, we're an audio first business first and foremost. We were founded in Belgium in 2008. We provide a full suite of technology solutions to both buyers and sellers of digital audio ad inventory. We're pioneers in audio specific advertising technology. And we provide our partners with the technology to buy and sell inventory both direct and programmatically, as well as host and distribute podcast content. And although we were acquired by Pandora, the music streaming service, in 2018, and then Pandora acquired by SiriusXM in 2019. We also work with many major web radio, music streaming, podcast producers, many of whom we would have seen at the recent podcast show in the UK, for example. It's Acast and it's Bauer in the UK alone, but many more hundreds globally. Um, but also, we're incredibly agnostic in this space as well. So we can work with any partner, whether on the demand side, whether on the supply side, regardless of the technology they use.
Interesting. And you mentioned Acast. Shout out to them for providing this studio. We couldn't have done it without them. So thank you so
100%.
much.
Thank you, folks.
So, in case you haven't heard of Edison Research, for the last 30 years, my company has studied media consumption. Through studies like the Infinite Dial or Edison Podcast Metrics, we track adoption and consumption of things like the radio, smartphones, and of course, podcasting. Now, we're also known for conducting the US election polls that get published by the news networks on election night to help us understand that $1 million question the entire world is asking itself right now. Why did Americans vote for whomever they voted for? So, as a third party, neutral company, we are not owned by any podcast network or political party. We have no skin in the game, as they say, and we call these shots as it is. We call a goal a goal. We call a 3-point shot in basketball a 3-point shot. And today we're able to do just that with media consumption in the UK. We're able to measure media consumption. Here's how. So in March of this year, we conducted a national survey of over 1,300 people in the UK, 16 and older. Over 300 surveys were conducted over the phone and about 1,000 conducted online. We do track back many of the findings to 2021, which was the last time we did the Infinite Dial in the UK. The resulting report can be summed up into a few categories. We just talked about the methodology and how we do this. Now we'll get into media and technology, social media, online audio, podcasts, which is a fan favorite, and in-car media. We'll see how things are changing there, Ali. All of these are interconnected, aren't they?
They are, yeah, and increasingly we're seeing, I think, that across the sort of the period of time. So we're contrasting 2021 with 2025. We've seen just an enormous change in the way that technology is consumed, but also then because the technology has advanced so much, the solutions and the opportunities which are available to listeners, available to publishers, available to buyers of advertising inventory have just progressed enormously across that period of time.
Yeah. So let's get to it. If you're watching this live and have any questions throughout, use the Q&A function in the Zoom app. Someone on our team will answer your questions. So let's start with this baby right here, the smartphone, right? The smartphone has certainly changed the way we communicate, the way we date, the way we consume digital media. And today, virtually everyone in the UK owns a smartphone, or 97% of the population. Now, that might not be surprising to too many people, but notice how that's a jump from 83% in 2021. More access to smartphones means more access to digital media like podcasting.
Yeah, and it kind of felt like back in 2021 we reached smartphone saturation. I think I had an iPhone 12 back then. I've got an iPhone 16 now. And we are also near a 100% smartphone ownership. So there obviously was somewhere to go. But I think that significant increase in smartphone ownership really reflects the advancement in technology where phones do even more. And that's arguably rendering some of those other devices less relevant, certainly the kind of the more analog ones. But it also means there's a greater consumption of digital audio on the go, which obviously impacts web radio, music streaming, and crucially, podcasting, and the increased prevalence of automated digital audio advertising. And also from that advertising, the ability for those advertisers to target listeners wherever and whenever they're consuming their favorite content. That kind of targeting capability has evolved so much across that period of time as well. So even those where there are because this is a key issue for us in Europe, even where there are specific listeners can't be targeted because of privacy constraints under GDPR regulations. Other solutions are available. So just one sort of small example is contextual targeting, enabling advertisers to target listeners in a podcast based upon the context of that podcast they're consuming without infringing those privacy regulations. So we've just seen an enormous increase of available technology, and that has really kind of facilitated this enormous growth in advertising.
And I'm sure these devices also yield a lot of data. They're also picking up some steam. If it didn't happen on the watch, it didn't happen. I recently got into running, starting to take it seriously a little bit more, and it's the worst when you go on this long run with the dog and you got the running app on to measure your stats, and then it turns off, and then you don't get to measure the stats or those steps.
It's not there. It didn't happen.
Yep. So smartwatch ownership has doubled in 4 years. Today, just under a quarter of Brits own one. Now, we've also seen an increase in tablet ownership. So that's some of the technology you were referring to, Ali.
Mm-hmm.
Technology like iPads, that's increased by 10 points since 2021. And another place where it's gotten easier for consumers to connect with some of these brands that you mentioned earlier, Ali, is in what we often call the center of home entertainment. So since 2021, the percentage of Brits owning a smart television has increased from 50% to just under 3/4. Smart TVs give people that chance, not only to come home after that long run with the dog, to plop down on the couch and turn on that TV to watch Last of Us on Sunday night, but to also come home from a long run the day after, turn on that TV, but this time to watch and listen to a podcast, perhaps about Last of Us, to cope and make sense of everything that happened the night before. Some of these episodes have been pretty brutal, by the way. I'm not sure if you're a fan of the show.
I need to watch it. I heard so many people talking about it, yes.
Don't start season 2. If you're not going to start it now, if you haven't started it, don't start it now because it's pretty traumatizing. So, according to our other research in Edison podcast metrics, many people are on the same boat, not necessarily listening to podcasts about zombie shows, but we are seeing an upward trend in podcast consumption on smart TVs in recent years in both the US and the UK.
Yeah, and I think that as with smartphones, the technology has evolved, and as people upgrade their TVs, they inevitably are going to be having a smart TV. No one has those. What are they? Cathode ray tube TVs. No one has them anymore. But also, they're on the next second or third kind of. I know I'm on sort of a second or third smart TV. So the capabilities, the technological capabilities of those TV sets is just evolving with each kind of new iteration. And this is only going to increase the opportunity for listeners to consume podcast and digital audio through other devices, through the smart TV, as well as alongside the smartphone and the and smart speakers, which we're going to talk about. But this is crucial though, whether they are consuming TV or not. Sorry, consuming video or not. So, for example, if I'm at home, and obviously lots of us work from home a few days a week these days. If my wife is working in the office at home and I'm in the living room, I'm listening to the radio, digital radio, or listening to a podcast through my TV. I never would have done that before, but purely because actually the capability didn't exist. But now actually the capability exists on all these devices, so we're taking advantage of it.
Interesting. I'm sure another place where you're doing a little bit of that is on smart speakers. We can't forget about them. Today, the Amazon Alexas, the Google Home, the Apple HomePods, the Nests, they're some of the easiest tech on which to fire up some of your favorite digital content, like you say. 45% or 22 million people in the UK own a smart speaker. That's nearly doubled since 2021.
Yeah, and that, I think that massive increase in smart speaker ownership, like the evolution in smart TVs, has enabled the consumption of digital audio and podcasting, but in every room as well. So the actually, you think traditionally radios were in the kitchen and the living room, but now because people have so many devices, the bedroom has actually become the most popular location for smart speakers, and those more analog devices, so linear devices I would call them, so AM FM radio obviously, but also DAB, those are being gradually replaced by the smart speaker, because if people are upgrading their radio, traditional radio, they ain't going to go and buy a DAB radio now, they're going to buy a smart speaker, which brings it multiple benefits of digital devices have, like around, again, for advertisers, around targeting IP addresses and things like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said the bedroom, because I have a smart speaker set up from the living room, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, one in the backyard. Now that I think about it, I also have a few in the bedroom, in multiple bedrooms. So other than feeling like the wannabe Tony Stark because I have an AI assistant in every room, it makes for that seamless experience for podcast listening, for music listening. Now, Amazon Alexas are the dominant players in the UK smart speaker market, but ownership of all brands have doubled in the last 4 years. Despite many of these being American companies, smart speaker ownership in the UK has overshadowed that of the States. So the rate of smart speaker ownership here in the US has been stagnant the past 4 years. Brits and Pink are more likely to own a smart speaker than Americans. I guess we just can't make a big deal out of this one, or you might start to see tariffs on smart speaker exports pretty soon.
Yeah, doesn't miss a trick, does he? Right. So, but I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Although the UK was slowest to adapt a smart speaker, that doubling of ownership has far outpaced the US. As you said, it's pretty stagnant actually, and that could be attributed to the UK's higher adoption of smart speakers during the pandemic. I kind of looked into this a little further because I was quite interested at the rate of change, which was significant, but also the UK was one of the first international markets to be targeted by Amazon for its smart Alexa devices, and also in the UK, those kind of the UK specific services like the good old BBC, Great British Institution, have been really, really fast to adapt to smart speakers as well, making that adoption far smoother for its listeners.
The BBC was one of the first to integrate many of their programs, their features into Amazon Alexas, Google Homes. It's been one of the biggest drivers. We know that the public media market here in the UK is very unique. It's very strong and robust compared to other markets, even in the US. Now, many of us prefer to consume media on our own through Bluetooth headphones. Note there are more people than ever like this who are doing this. Over half of Brits 16 plus own wireless headphones, and that's double the rate of 2021. So, ownership of various tech has increased in the UK, all but the ownership of physical radios. Today, one quarter of Brits in red here do not have a traditional radio in their household. The percentage of people on this boat has increased 3 points since 2021. Other media that we measured this year, starting with one of my favorite categories, gaming. Do you play video games at all?
Not a gamer.
No. Okay, I was going to ask for your gamer tag, but
I don't even know what that is.
How many Brits are gaming weekly? 32% report playing games on their mobile device each week, while 22% report playing on a gaming console or system. By the way, it's a great way to keep in touch with your friends if any of your other friends play video games.
Well, interestingly, actually, neither I nor my friends do, but actually what we are seeing is a real increase in the amount of hyper casual gaming inventory which we get at AdsWiz, because some of these vendors we work with actually can enable the serving of in-game audio ads, which is sort of a non-interruptive kind of format. So we've seen, although I don't play, I'm not target audience, we've seen a massive increase in the amount of available inventory from people who are playing these hyper casual games, whether that's a Sudoku or Candy Crush type games. So I can well believe that it's increased immeasurably across that period of time.
That's interesting. I've heard of this as well. In-game audio ads, less intrusive. People are leaned in. They don't have to cut out their games to get more lives, right?
It's also eyes, ears, and hands. All senses are kind of engaged when people are playing these games. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
That's super interesting. Now, Ali, I'm not sure if you're much of an audiobook listener, but there are 18 million people who listened to an audiobook in the last year here in the UK. And although the percentage of audiobook listeners has been stagnant the past 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that it's kind of stagnant, because I think you've also seen a massive increase in podcasting, which I would imagine has taken some of that, has taken away some of the growth potential, perhaps. I mean, again, I'm a book reader. I'm a physical analog book reader, and I read it though because of the physical nature of feeling a book in my hands. I think podcasting is a very, very different experience to audio books,
for sure.
Right? But you can't beat a good book. The physical nature of it. We're probably digressing slightly there, aren't we?
No, I 100% agree with you. There's just so much audiobooks are very comprehensive, and being able to wrap up the subject from beginning to end, deep dive into something, and just cover this comprehensive view, holistic view of a certain topic. Podcasting can do that too. It can dive into information, but you can have a chat like we're having right now, talking about video games and audiobooks, and that for some people might be more engaging. And you're absolutely foreshadowing what we're going to see with podcasting later on. But let's first start with social media, the world of memes, posts, follows, likes, doom scrolling. We saw an increase in smartphone ownership earlier. So it's not surprising that we're also seeing a slight rise in social media users. 44 million Brits, or 90%, currently engage with any sort of social media. In the UK, we do see higher usage for Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and notable here is X, the difference between usage of X in the UK versus the US. We've actually seen a decline for the usage of X in the US. Any thoughts on this finding, Ali?
Well, on X, I would imagine it's incredibly even more divisive in the US, right? I mean, one need to only look at the political climate there over the last 4 years. it can be fairly toxic, and a certain individual will have either a huge amount of support or a huge amount of opposition. So that I'm not surprised in that finding.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's not so. Maybe the sentiment isn't as intense here in the UK.
No, no, it's not, but it's certainly kind of crept through. There's a lot of I see a lot of car stickers on the back of Teslas these days.
You should
I
see.
bought this before I knew what a Dickie was.
It's also hard to switch out of a Tesla after you've been paying for it for years.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we also asked the Brits which platforms they use most often, and in the last 4 years, we've seen this usage shift from Facebook, Snapchat, and X over to Instagram and TikTok. Much of that is being driven by younger generations. Note how Instagram here and TikTok is the primary brand that over half of 16 to 34-year-olds say they use most often. Now, beyond social media, the Infinite Dial also measures online audio. So, gains in tech ownership have set the stage for more online audio adoption and consumption. Monthly online audio listening is up in the UK compared to 4 years ago. That is the combination of music, spoken word audio on internet radio, online streaming players, and podcast directories. Weekly online audio listenership has also increased in the last 4 years. Up to 3/4 of people in the UK say they listen to online audio each week. And believe it or not, online audio is more popular in the UK than in the US, just slightly, 2 points higher on the right here. Now, co-listening is a big topic of discussion, and we do get a sense of that here in this question that we asked to Brits. And about half report listening to audio with others occasionally or frequently. That must have some implication for audio advertisers, huh, Ali?
I think that is going to be the implications for audio advertisers is going to be where people are targeting kind of IP addresses in the home, etc., where it can be difficult to if you can capture the IP, you capture the consent of the listener, you've not got a kind of guarantee who is actually listening in there because it might be a family. So there's difficulties around targeting the individuals rather than if you've got one person listening on their own and you get consent to listen to that individual on their mobile device, you know exactly who you're targeting.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way. I always thought of it as audio advertisers are reaching more people because more people listen together. About half here in the UK, which is stand for something, right? Advertisers do benefit from this as well, but you also get that complication. Now, when we boil down the consumer's primary source, we see that Spotify has made significant gains in the past 4 years. 39% of Brits use Spotify most often for online audio, up from 19 4 years ago. BBC's share has decreased, while others stagnated. Again, this is a primary source used most often among Brits for online audio. Now, 16 to 34-year-olds are driving this transformation. Just under 2/3 of this cohort in the UK say they use Spotify most often for online audio. BBC Sounds is the number one source for 55 and older. Now, again, we saw an increase in social media usage overall slightly, but we also have seen an increase in online audio overall with the combination of music, spoken word like podcasts, and the increase in tech ownership also sets the stage for more podcast listening opportunities. The question is, did podcasts capitalize on this? Are more people actually listening in 2025? So, Ali, I think we can get into it. The current state of UK podcast consumption. Do you remember the days when we struggled to explain a podcast to people?
Yeah, so I think the actual concept of podcasting is like a portmanteau, isn't it, between sort of the iPod and broadcast. And this was over 20 years ago. This term was coined. I don't think we have the problem trying to explain what a podcast is these days. I'm old enough to have worked in magazine advertising. Remember them?
Yes.
And I worked at a couple of big magazine publishers, and we published quite niche titles like horse and hound titles and photography and hobby magazines, as well as broader music and lifestyle titles. And I liken podcasts today as providing that sort of service where users, listeners are able to discover very niche content which really reflects what individual passions are. There's so much, back in the day, there was so much magazine content out there. Here, there is so much podcasting content, and the kind of the crucial similarity here is that both mediums can be consumed on the move, and they're very, very sort of personal, kind of immersive mediums. So yeah, I mean, I love podcasting. I was a big advocate for magazines back in the day. They've sort of had their day. They're a bit redundant, aren't they? But audio as a medium is one of the oldest media. It's just that it's adapted incredibly well to current technology.
Yeah, in the digital world. And that's such a throwback with magazines and also a great comparison. I guess at some point it'll be harder to explain what a magazine is than a podcast to the younger generation. I guess that's the year I start losing track of my age. Now, the overwhelming majority of people in the UK are familiar with podcasting, or an estimated 44 million people. That's a jump from 71% in 2021.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the pandemic as being a massive inflection point for consumption of digital audio and advertising, indeed, because one followed the other. And I think people's relationship with the content they consumed fundamentally changed back then. And it does. When you find yourself locked down, as the phrase was, right? You find yourself indoors, you find yourself really restricted and limited in terms of the number of people you can interact with and spend time with. I think audio, but also podcasts particularly, became incredibly important as a source of information, a source of relaxation, a source of comfort in very, very difficult times. And I think that the beauty of kind of podcasting, I think, was its sort of ability to build kind of community around content. You had millions of listeners of certain kind of shows, so there's a real kind of community based around what those shows were talking about at the time. So incredibly important role they served and continue to do so.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the nail, Ali. Our other research shows that word of mouth and people sharing these podcast listening experiences with others has been one of the major drivers in this increase in awareness, just telling people about it. Now, naturally, the more people know about the medium, the more tech there is for access to podcasting, the more people will listen. And that's exactly what happened in the last 4 years. 68% or 33 million Brits have ever tried a podcast at one point in their lives. This, my friends, is a significant increase since 2021.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. So there's a difference between being aware of it to consuming, or sorry, listening to one, and then I think we'll come on later and talk about consumption. But yeah, now bear in mind, sort of people had very little else to do back in 2021, which obviously explains the adoption of them, the increase in audio listening, the increase in ad spend. But if you sort of think about, if we fast forwarded to where we are today, we have the choice to be in or out. We have the choice to spend time who we want to with. And actually also from like just after 2021, 2022, when people are like, hey, I'm free, I can go out, blah, blah, blah. We still have seen a 15% increase on podcast listening, i.e. ever listen to it, versus where we were back in 2021. So actually that's significant. We're going to reach that kind of peak podcast, I think, because I think there's so many people listening, so many different places, in so many more ways, on so many more devices. So yeah, like I said, technology has kind of facilitated that evolution for sure.
Sure. And you say a lot more places to listen. There are also a lot more directories today, too. And here are just the top 4 services UK weekly podcast listeners say they use most often for listening to podcasts. Spotify here has a larger share, followed by YouTube. BBC Sounds is certainly a big player here in the UK, not so much in the US or other markets.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be. And it's interesting, actually, because Apple Podcasts has a bigger share in kind of other markets as well. So these sort of shares vary considerably depending on the market. So the number of distribution platforms are myriad. these four here. It's not now just audio platforms; it's video platforms as well. It's important though to distinguish between how podcasts is consumed by the listener, like you and I, versus how podcast producers host, distribute, and monetize their podcast. So, I'm sure when you were traveling here today, I certainly was. When I was listening to a podcast. Actually, I was listening to a podcast via Spotify is my platform. You might have listened via Apple, but those podcasts are hosted and distributed on via a plethora of platforms, CMSs, content management systems, which host, distribute this podcast content to those platforms. Simplecast, it's an AdsWizz one.
Mm-hmm.
Megaphone, it's a Spotify one. Acast, partner of AdsWizz's. Art19, owned by Amazon. Omni Studio, owned by Triton, which is iHeart. So there's really, really big global content owners are getting in on the ownership as well. But regardless of which platform you work with, AdsWizz works with all of them agnostically for monetization. So if there's anybody listening in here looking for a monetization partner, look me up.
Yes.
I'm on LinkedIn. There's the pitch. No more.
and the advertising space can get so confusing, Ali, and you're a great contact to reach out to if anyone needs wisdom
For
or
sure.
guidance.
I'll be very
on
impartial, Gabriel. Very impartial.
People are using various services, like you mentioned. Some of these, like you mentioned, also include video. Now, with the Infinite Dial's long history of tracking data, we can't just change our definition of a podcast when measuring consumption, but we can certainly expand upon it carefully. So we first asked podcast consumption in the same way we always have, using our standard definitions, and we found that 68% of Brits have ever listened to a podcast, which you saw earlier. But this year we didn't stop there. We then asked the question, have you ever watched a podcast? And 46% of people in the UK said yes to watching a podcast. Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap. Many people say yes to both. And while audio listening seems to be the dominant form of consumption, there is a small group of people who said they have ever watched a podcast but did not listen. Accounting for these exclusive watchers, our estimate is 3 points higher at 71%. Now, this chart here might help you visualize this concept. By including those who reported watching but not listening, our estimate stands at 35 million. That's an additional 2 million Brits. This is the best way to account for both audio only and video consumption listenership, with the ability to look at both groups separately in the future. Again, both audio only and video podcast listenership.
Yeah, it's interesting. It does reflect the fact that some people are listening or consuming podcasts only on video. It's still a relatively small percent, 3%.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority is still listening and watching, but reflecting the fact that I think podcast is an audio first medium, and that kind of begs the question: when are people watching only? Why would people watch only? It has to be really, really engaging content in order to watch podcast content only. Then it sort of blurs the lines between, well, what's a podcast for video and what's actually TV programming kind of stuff. But when we talk about, I think, podcast and video podcast, I think we need to think about kind of the concept of podcast and what else are we doing when we are consuming a podcast. Like if I'm commuting, working out, I'm in the kitchen, these are activities which engage other senses. So it's more difficult to view video at the same time. That said, and so that's why I think podcasting is and always will be an audio first medium. However, obviously we've seen significant moves from Spotify in this space, and a big increase in podcast video, and Spotify really addressing the podcast video on their platform and the monetization thereof. And obviously YouTube, as we've seen there as a distribution platform, is a key distribution platform for podcasts as well. So I think it's certainly a generational thing as well, and I think younger listeners are probably far more likely to be listening and viewing podcasts sort of simultaneously,
Yeah.
or viewing them alone. But
Hmm.
like I said, for me, and I think most folks, podcast is an audio first medium, and until the content on that video becomes kind of super engaging, there's not a real reason to kind of to be completely invested in it.
Yeah. And you bring up a great point, and I think this is also evidence that shows if someone is listening to a show on the video version, it could possibly be going back to the audio version when it's time to pick up, do those chores, go out to the car, go on a walk. Um, Here's evidence that suggests that. While I do think there needs to be more research that tracks that, this is evidence that audio only is the place where people go to. So,
And also, I think that there are currently some sort of some limitations on monetizing video podcast inventory in terms of dynamic ad insertion on these platforms. So I believe that YouTube can do it. This is a video first platform, but podcasters who are have video podcasts on Spotify, for example, are running baked in host read campaigns only at the moment. So there is a limitation for kind of programmatic advertising in video podcast, which you don't have in audio first podcast.
yeah, and the consumer is also starting to notice some of these, as you say, limitations when there are double the ads on the video, baked in video, perhaps on the YouTube platform, you start to get ads that are not related to the podcast. It's through the platform as well. So both on the consumer side and on the publishing advertising side, I think things are only going to get better from here.
Yeah, I think the user experience is going to improve immeasurably as
Hmm.
the businesses work out what's the best way of dynamically inserting ads into video podcasts.
Yeah. So we also extended this process of measurement for both audio only and those video exclusive watchers, as we say. And the estimate for monthly listeners are 25 million people who are listening to podcasts monthly in the UK, accounting for both video and audio podcast consumers. That's 51% or more than half of all Brits. A milestone for the world of podcasting. More people listen to podcasts every month than those that don't. I guess we can call it the mainstream milestone.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the really key metric. This is people who are regularly consuming podcasts, not have ever consumed it,
Mhm.
not who are familiar with it. These are people who are regularly You can probably drill down even further into weekly podcast consumption. But like you say, it's undeniable that podcasting is the mainstream now. It's no fly by night medium. It's post pandemic was no temporary blip.
Mhm.
The figure today is much higher. Like I said, this is regular monthly consumption. Actually, this is really reflected in the fact that, as well as listening figures increasing, the advertising, it was the single biggest advertising growth sector in each of the past 4 years,
Mm.
up until 2024. And that is compared with CTV, with native, with display, with search. So it really is, or has been up until now, the single most dynamic advertising vertical.
And that's according to the IAB. Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely, yes.
No worries.
We need a reference there.
Just
That is according to the IAB, not just Ollie Chadwick.
just so people can find it too, which is I was surprised by that statistic as well. I think that's a great finding. Now there is some variation when it comes to gender, when it comes to monthly podcast listenership, more so than there were 4 years ago. Today, 56% of UK men listen monthly versus 46% of UK women. So much of the growth in listenership came from the male side these past 4 years. You do see a slight growth among women as well. But these types of temperature checks help us understand where adoption has fallen behind or where it's not rising as fast as in other places. So the industry can take a look at this, target, prioritize where it needs to redirect its efforts for continued growth of the medium.
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised at this figure, so I dug into it a bit further. So yeah, good news. We've seen increases from male and female. Male was up actually 33% across that period. Female across 15% of that period. It could be down to kind of the dominance of male hosts in podcasts. Many top-ranking podcasts are hosted by men or have more male hosts, especially in genres like news, sport, comedy, politics. If you look at the top UK ranking podcasts, they tend to be in those genres, right? This male dominance, in turn, I think, can influence listener demographics as audiences gravitate towards hosts they clearly identify with, who they have an affinity with. And also, though, those key platforms have more of a male skew. So we're looking at, Spotify and Apple and YouTube. So yes, that all kind of lends itself to an increase in more male consumption of podcasting. I think, though, the good news is that in the last 12 months, we've seen an increase in female listenership. The gap is narrowing. So interestingly, we do this again in 2029 versus 2025. Hopefully we'll see a kind of a more even balance. Monthly podcast listenership amongst women actually rose by 20% in the past year. And that, I think, is probably reflective of the fact that the sort of the skew of female hosted podcasts is kind of slowly increasing. Obviously, we're talking here about a 4-year period, so you've got even across that. But to your point, though, it's about informing these sorts of demographics inform what sort of podcast content people need to create in order to redress that sort of balance.
Yeah, for sure. And we see that too, that sentiment in the Women's Podcast Listener Report. Although US based, we have seen that women are more likely to listen and more likely to be engaged if the host is also a woman, which makes sense. It's not surprising, but it does go to show where the opportunity is, right?
Absolutely.
So monthly listenership also soared among 16 to 34-year-olds, jumping 21 points. Monthly listenership also increased among 35 to 54-year-olds by 12 points. That's a more modest gain, but still very significant. Both groups surpassed the mainstream milestone since 2021. The majority of each group are listening to podcasts every month. Now, however, there was no change among the 55 plus, a group that we often see in our research, accustomed to other forms of media like the radio. Yeah. But they continue to adopt devices that are podcast friendly. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by this. It backs up everything we've sort of been saying. 50% increase in podcast listening for 16 to 34-year-olds. Unsurprised we see that level of growth. I think that podcasting is an established medium. It's a trusted source of information for people now. It's personalized, it's flexible, it's an intimate listening experience. It's earbuds in a lot of the time, so it sort of feels like it's very sort of intimate, relatable. There is now an increase in the kind of the discoverability of podcasting as well. You're going to get the algorithm is going to suggest other podcast shows, other podcast episodes. There are big podcast networks. You can advertise other podcasts within that. So, and it's also integrated into other elements of life. There's, these podcasts are not just podcast shows now. They're events, they're live events, things like that. So actually, it's become kind of a part of everybody's everyday life. And that's only going to increase. I think it's only going to increase. I think digital audio consumption per se is going to increase as well. If you look at this, we're talking about, say, 1634 specifically, demographically, they are digital natives. They grew up with digital devices, not like me, who I grew up very analog. I'm a digital immigrant. These people are digital natives. They will not consume until an alternative to digital audio or digital devices comes up. They will not consume content on another device. They will not regress to analog, to AM, FM, to DAB. That's kind of here to stay. Actually, as those older demographics will kind of pass on. So actually, the percentage sounds awful, doesn't it? but the percentage of people listening on more analog devices is just going to kind of fade away.
Yeah, there will be changes that we will see in the future, especially if the younger generations and any indication of what future consumption might look like and future listenership. And I also love how you say lifestyle because that's been a lot of research that we've done recently. Now, podcast listeners often find their favorite host, their community, part of their identity. We have seen a lot of sentiment that agrees with everything you just said about that sense of identity and lifestyle, which is great for both the host, the podcast listener, and brands that are looking to advertise and connect with those consumers.
Yeah, and also actually some of those big shows are doing these live events and they're creating merch.
Mm.
They're kind of like spit a lot of bands when bands go on tour now.
Yeah.
It's not just the musical output. It's the tours, it's the merch, it's the ticket sales. So they're kind of becoming these sort of more immersive 360 experiences.
For sure. Now, comparing things to the US, monthly listenership in the UK slightly lags behind the States. There's a bit of a 4 point difference here in monthly listenership. Now, everyone should also know weekly listenership in the UK. You alluded to this earlier. 19 million Brits reported listening to podcasts each week. That's 39% up from 25 4 years ago. Note how exclusive video podcast consumers here, or those who say they watch podcasts but do not listen to one each week, account for 6% of all Brits.
Yeah, so I guess that's maybe this, you call them the slightly more hardcore
Yeah.
podcast listeners. They're listening more regularly. Interesting that they're consuming on video. Perhaps that's a sort of a sign of kind of a movement towards video consumption of podcasting by their sort of regular, hardcore podcast listeners. Maybe and also though the younger demographic is consuming them more. So actually, the younger demographic is perhaps more likely to watch a podcast than listen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not surprised by that.
We see that too. We also see it again among the male group, just slightly though, and we saw that earlier in the monthly podcast listening statistics. Now, comparing the rate of weekly consumers to the U.S., the UK again is slightly behind. However, it is gaining on U.S. weekly podcast listenership, closes the gap to 2 points compared to 4 points in 2021. Among these weekly listeners, 4 podcast episodes. 4 podcast episodes is the average number consumed each week. 19% listen to 6 or more episodes each week. These findings are positive news for UK podcasting, especially as it stands to grow in a very crucial area for audio media, in the car. Now, another finding showcases this in-car opportunity for podcasting and other digital media. So I'm just going to quickly source another finding from a different study called Edison Podcast Metrics, which we do here in the UK among weekly listeners. In this statistic, we find that most UK audiences who consume podcasts each week say they listen to podcasts most often at home. 59%. Walking around or on foot is the second most popular location. And then there's a car in third place. So while podcasting does deserve that praise for competing with other media at home, the car could be the key for future growth, especially as we've seen, maybe tech ownership and technology, which has been a factor in podcast listening, start to cap off a little bit with the smartphone. And the awareness, naturally, as more people are aware of the medium, the more people that are going to listen. That's also starting to hit a ceiling because you can only 100% of the population can be aware of the medium. So where does podcasting stand to grow in the future? We're seeing it here. Brits are adopting tech that makes it easier for people to fire up a podcast in the car. Among Brits who drive or ride in a car each month, the percentage of drivers who have access to these automotive integration systems like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, podcast-friendlier dashboards, has more than doubled in the last 4 years. As you might have guessed, radio remains the king of the car, with 72% of Brits who have who drive in a car or ride in a car monthly reporting listening to the radio, but the number of Brits listening to podcasts in the car has increased significantly from 15% to 22%.
Yeah, and that's a 50% increase. That's massive, and that huge, those huge in-car integration opportunities you referenced, Google and Apple, have only increased digital listening capabilities, while that linear audio has remained static. My old car was actually I had I think I had an FM radio and a podcast, a CD player in there. I've upgraded recently. I've only got DAB radio in my car.
Yeah.
But I can but then I Bluetooth my phone to my
Mhm.
in-car entertainment. I'm listening to podcasts, and I'm listening to Spotify, and I'm streaming audio. So actually, Bluetoothing connecting phones is absolutely the way forward, and that's only going to facilitate the consumption of podcasts and other audio in the car. And it really, I think, one, it reflects the population's appetite for podcasts on the go. But also, I think where the capability to listen to podcasts exists, people will consume them. So it's not just for the home, it's not just for exercising, and it's certainly not just to consume on video, because if you're consuming video podcasts in the car and driving, you're in trouble. But the technology is driving the consumption, and also there's more of an opportunity for advertisers here, because again, if you're consuming digital audio in the car, then actually you're far more addressable listener if you're listening digitally through your phone in a car than you are listening in a more of a linear kind of analog way.
Yeah, for sure. Makes it easier for consumers and advertisers, vice versa, to connect with each other.
Yeah, and look, if advertisers are targeting listeners more effectively in the car because they've got access to the listeners' data, it's actually a better. I mean, people talk about advertising being a bit invasive, but if it's relevant advertising, if it's contextually relevant advertising you've delivered in a podcast that you're listening to, that's a good thing.
Yeah, to your point, Ali, about advertisers connecting with consumers. Consumers don't often admit this, but I think they are willing to connect with advertisers when they see recommendation for something they've been looking for the past week. It's hard to notice. It's hard to track that down. We often do see in our surveys that we have positive sentiment for podcast advertisers, especially podcast advertisers, because they know that many of those brands are supporting their favorite shows, their favorite hosts, and they're highly relevant to their lifestyle, this identity we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, historically, the beauty of podcast advertising was that it was usually host reads or sponsorships. So the brand was creating affinity between themselves and the show, and the listener could identify with that. When you're looking at the dynamically inserted ads and programmatic ads, this is where the technology has evolved in order to, because you can't directly target individuals with behavioral ads because you can't collect consent from them. We've seen this evolution in contextual targeting, contextually relevant ads in the absence of targeting individual listeners. Otherwise, advertising can sort of feel a little bit invasive. We've all had that experience when we were on a web page, haven't we, where you get I always I'm not gonna highlight the newspaper site I was thinking of just now, but it lights up like a Christmas tree when you go onto it. It's a horrible experience, but that's the beauty of podcasting though as well, is that you're only being served one ad at any one time. Hopefully it's relevant to you an additive to the listening experience. But even if it's not, it's only one at a time. You're not getting bombarded by multiple display ads.
I just imagined 2 ads running at the same time, 3 ads in your headphones.
Brain would explode.
Compared to the US, there are a few differences when it comes to media consumption in the radio, most notably online audio and podcast here. More people in the US use those in the car, and that's an indication of what podcasting might look like in the future, though. for UK drivers and passengers. We can also look to younger Brits and how they're more likely to choose podcasts in the car as another indicator. 16% say they listen to podcasts most often. That's among that younger age group, 16 to 34, compared to other audio sources like radio. All right, so this was a data heavy presentation, Ali, a lot for one session. So let's sum it up for the viewers. Let's start with tech adoption. So we noticed that all but the physical radios increased since 2021. Ownership of other technology like smartphones, smartwatches, smart TVs, all but physical radios increased in the UK since 2021.
Yeah, and I think that is a commentary on just how quickly technology evolves and the capabilities which all of those devices have. We've probably we've not reached saturation points in the house, so we can have have the luxury of having these actually quite affordable smart speakers, for example, in every room. I don't know how much an Alexa is, 30, 40 quid, something like that. So it's easy to do. Yeah, for sure, it's facilitated by the by advancements in technology, and that in turn has helped with the increase in advertising effectiveness and efficiency. The social media shifted to Instagram and TikTok as massively unsurprising. I think they are the younger social medias. Facebook is probably for people of my age. It's no surprise that Instagram is owned by Meta, because Zuckerberg's obviously looking at it, oh, hang on a minute, my Facebook users are quite old. Let's get people hooked on Instagram, and like TikTok is very much kind of, they're both actually, tellingly, they're both video first platforms as well, right? For kind of creators to to upload content on. So absolutely no surprise that as technology has been adopted far more by people and far more by younger people, those are the platforms that benefit.
Yeah. And it also, technology also leads to more online audio. That is another observation, a key observation from this report. More people than ever in the UK are consuming online audio.
Yeah, and I pointed out actually earlier on, I think, the pandemic was a kind of an inflection point. People's relationship with digital audio changed immeasurably there. And it's just grown ever since. Yeah, podcast listenership reaching record highs again. Unsurprising, because I think people have realised that it's no fly by night medium. So the cost to enter podcasting as a medium for creators is significantly lower than it is for any video kind of AV, as opposed to just the A kind of medium. And so people will be creating more and more content. As people create more content, there will be more listenership. You've got more and more podcast production companies forming, partners of ours, like Acast. We're sitting here in Acast's wonderful studios here, and these are huge studios. I think we're in Studio 3, are we?
3, yep.
So they definitely got 3 at least. So it kind of shows that the opportunity to record and distribute podcasts is huge as well. And then obviously businesses like ours, and Spotify has grown enormously across that time. SiriusXM in the US as well are only really facilitating the growth of podcast listenership and also podcast advertising as well.
Yeah, and something else that might affect podcast listenership and the adoption of podcasting in the future is the increase in the number of Brits who have access to automotive integration systems in the car. That includes the Android Autos, the Apple CarPlays. People in the UK who have access to that has more than doubled in the last 4 years, which makes it easier for podcast consumption.
Far easier. In it's kind of like, what is it, Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come. And it's like, if you've got the technological kind of capability, then people will consume it. people consume it wherever they are. Like I said in one of those last slides there, it's not just about working out or commuting or cooking. It's kind of like, right, I'm traveling, I want to listen to a podcast because that's my medium of choice. It's digital audio, it's music, and it's podcasting. Those are the, you know, those are the sort of the audio entertainment that people are most plugged into now.
Yeah.
And then obviously in turn, because the technology is facilitating this growth, then it's inevitable that the podcast consumption in the car is going to increase, because podcast has increased, podcast consumption per se has increased, and it's easier to do in a car. So why wouldn't people listen in the car?
Yeah, and we saw significant gains in the past 4 years, likely because of that. And we also refer to age, right? Younger folks are more likely to prefer podcasting compared to other sources.
Yeah, absolutely. Podcasts are a wonderful medium.
Go podcasting.
Go podcast.
So there you have it, folks. Thanks for joining us today. We can't wait to see what you do with this data. Please stay connected with us and let us know how you do. Ali, thank you for meeting with me here and sharing your rich insights.
And likewise, Gabriel, thank you very much for putting all this fantastic work together. And it's been quite enlightening for me to read some of this research, and I'm looking forward to sharing it at the podcast show as well.
Yes. And thank you so much to the Edison research team, who also works really diligently to put this together. A lot of items to take care of in this presentation. And shout out to Amy Noling, who served as our producer today. We kind of just rushed her into it, but she's doing a great job. She's listening to us right now, letting us know if the mic drops. A downloadable version of this report will be available on edisonresearch.com. Thanks again to AdsWiz, SiriusXM for sponsoring the report and bringing it back to the UK. And of course, shout out to Acast, who let us use this beautiful technology to make a podcast of our own.
Absolutely. We're hugely appreciated. Thank you for having us in your wonderful studios.
Bye-bye.